I'd like to start to just say that we're very privileged to be in Helsinki, not only because of this wonderful conference. You are all very privileged to be in Helsinki because in Helsinki you can go to the Nordic Library. You didn't know they existed, right? Yes. So usually it's the privilege of about 600 people live in Helsinki, and now they can add about some 100 too. Dramatic change, isn't it? I would say that that illustrates the situation of libraries. And I would say that to the benefit of all, we're quite tired. I could end the whole conference with a follow conclusion. If we don't foresee any possible future of libraries provide any kind of access which is similar to YouTube and Google, I suggest we end the conference right now having a glass of nice wine and socialize. Or should we perhaps elaborate on a possible solution? I will not really, I wrote these slides written 20 minutes to 3 this morning, and I heard many good things said, so I might skip some. But as the Nordic Library is actually silo, there's a door you can enter it. But in general, libraries and archives are silos. And they will remain so unless you actually reconsider the business model entirely. They're based on an old concept which is obsolete. And as I said, people resort to Google and YouTube, even researchers. The only way to actually make them relevant is to have a viable business model. And that is not the business model of Google, because Bookshelf is a wonderful project, but I believe it's some 100,000 books, some 20,000 public domain. It's not a game changer. We need a game changer for library and archives, and the solution in copyright has to be a game changer itself, has to underpin such a business model. Europeana is a culture project, is not going to be the game changer, period. Because institutions will never afford the license schemes or the digitization. There is an actual on-demand model in the analog world which gives cross-border access, the interlibrary loan. In every country there's money to finance that. In Sweden about 10 million Swedish crowns, which is about 1 million euros. It costs about 50 pounds, 50 euros to ship a book. Even more than to buy it actually. So we discussed with my non-attorney colleague who sits down there in the back, Christopher, a possible alternative solution. Use the money, substitute with technology, and give access on demand. Provide access to the catalog, you tell us what you want, and we digitize it. It's kind of Google, but we have that kind of thing to digitize, but still, I think it would be a successful model. So we tested it actually, and to test it we just reasoned what kind of copyright solution. Well, exceptions, limitations equals to the same kind of silos as the libraries themselves. They are limited by the jurisdiction. And the whole purpose to explore this is because the Google YouTube is default, it's global. And the National Library Archive, who perceives themselves as that important that they could compete with Google, I think has misunderstood their position in the world. And also, the user perspective here is not the library, it's you here in the audience. Scholars, researchers, that's the user. And we are the intermediary, and we are competing, so to speak, with Google and YouTube. How to do that? Well, as I said, exceptions, limitations on a global stage doesn't work at all. So collective licensing, which is not confined to one jurisdiction, ought to be the solution. So let's explore that. And that's what me and my colleague Christopher Natsen did. He's the researcher. He has the user perspective. He has colleagues. So we identified that we did have lots of digital material which didn't need to be digitized, broadcast, which Lars Grönqvist referred to from 1960s. Why don't let that material available first in a national pilot, then in a cross-border pilot with Finland. And so we did. First Sweden and then Finland. And Lars already elaborated on the technology as far as copyright, how to do that. ECL. We have ECL provisions that would underpin a traditional collective license to incorporate the outsiders. I'll skip some of these slides because time's flying. Is that to make this work with the rights holders, we had a streaming method, no downloads, it's good enough. And the approach was parallel licensing. You could say, more or less like, if the National Library in Finland would have done the same thing, that's what we did. We did it in Sweden, did it in Finland, which meant that the broadcasts were cleared in Sweden, the Swedish territory, by traditional collective license. Then, of course, as far as the outsiders, in that respect, we utilized the extended effect of the ECL, and the same in Finland. Traditional licensing, which relied on traditional collective licensing organizations with reciprocal agreements, transfer mandate, supplemented by the regulation in both countries on ECL. No extended effect, no extension across the border, no extraterritorial effect, I would argue, as well as Copy Sweden and Copy Osto. That's very in brief what we did. Nothing fancy, quite traditional. And why is this good? Well, because it's demand-driven. The model we think will be the prevailing one because we don't have money to digitize whole collections. That's the only way to be an archive library for the future. Here you have the catalog. And what we envisioned, the National Library, because we are a part of the consortium of 87 National Library Research Libraries of Europe, is to combine all our catalogs and provide a license scheme for education and research possibly to on-demand digitization, and of course a completely different business model than the one this consortium right now relies on, which is for public domain. Anyone in the world could order a copy and pay for it. So the EU kind of scheme is Europeana, honestly. Any other kind of scheme that says any and all will not work. There's no money. It's a vision, it's a utopia, it's wonderful, and it's never going to happen. It hasn't happened yet. The only one who can afford this is Google. So look into practicalities, please, and get really serious about how to find money in government budgets and also the user perspective, because at the end of the day, it's for politicians to make decisions. If this is not going to fly and have any impact, there's no interest, really. So, questions from the organizers was like licensing of mixed materials, including works from other countries. Well, ECL on a national level operates with a kind of default that you have influx from other countries, like the photocopying. So, in principle, it shouldn't be a problem. We do country by country. But all depends to really how mature the market, the CMOs, especially what kind of material and the kind of rights holders. So you cannot resort to ECL without due diligence of the CMO RO. I think that's one of the key issues, really. But in principle, you could do it, I think. Licensing, access abroad, how far could you go? Well, if you mean geographically, global access is something you could achieve. I don't see a problem with such. As long as you consider that you have the author's right to opt out, and as pointed out in the original ECL invented in the 60s, you also have an additional safeguard, which you don't have in all ECL provisions because it felt not to be needed. But if the CMO is very diligent, it shouldn't not be a problem. The relationship with other solutions. While we cannot perhaps expect every country to introduce ECL, but if you do it this way, you have to have mandates. So you could possibly have a solution that we in Sweden give access in Australia if they have a compulsory license, but not necessarily the other way around. You could envision a system, a scheme from Sweden ECL and another country collective licensing an exception or a limitation. The other way around, with that kind of hybrid, possibly. But again, at the end of the day, what is required to be successful is that you can provide a nice service. And the problem with exceptions, a compulsory license, or a hybrid which relies partly on exception limitation, is that it could be the case it doesn't facilitate that service that the users want. So in the long run, the best thing to use is, as we all know, a contract. It has the flexibility to meet the demand in the digital world, and as long as ECL is perceived to be a contract which be extended, there's a future for these solutions and libraries. But if the Commission comes to conclusions is different, then it might be the case that EU will have a silo, and the rest of the world, who may not view ECL as an exception or limitation, may very well be better off. I hope it will be that it will be stay to be perceived as a contract, and that you will be able to achieve this kind of access. And finally, these pilots that I referred to has not yet been launched, but hopefully they will be launched, and they will provide a nice kind of lab for scholars and others to look into, and also for the policymakers, because it's not a wise idea to legislate before you have no experience whatsoever of facts. Thank you.